Thank you for joining me. Well, this part of the show we call You Be the Judge. You've met Mark Schnapp, who is a prominent, a very high-achieving lawyer over here in the USA, based in Florida. The other part of this equation is Joseph Kotrie-Monson, lawyer and broadcaster. So let me just give you a background to some of the subjects, and I'm going to do a longer intro, and Joseph, forgive me for doing this. I feel like I'm in court. We've been discussing Grenfell before. The police have just said there's no charges until the end of 2026. There's 19 companies or organisations currently under investigation. It's very complicated. The police want to do it properly. Now, we're about to talk about companies and their liabilities and what have you. Now, for a very specific reason, let me say, and I won't let Joseph say this, so we keep our hands legally above board. The reason we are not covering it in this part of the show is that because Joseph Kotrie-Monson is one of the lead lawyers in the Grenfell Fire criminal investigation. So we are not touching that. Any part of this next debate has got nothing to do with that. So, Joseph, what I want to focus on about something you can comment on, the recent Thames, Yorkshire and Northumbrian Water face £168 million penalty following the sewage investigation earlier this month. However, they're now talking about the Labour Party is under their key measure of the government's plans is that water company executives, never mind just about fines, they could face up to 2 years in prison if they obstruct environmental investigations. And also, the poor old Environment Agency has to run up loads and loads of costs when it brings these enforcement cases. Now, the Labour government is saying we'll make those companies pay for all of that. So my question to you and then Mark in the USA, when companies either lie or have been found to give misleading information or been negligent, which leads to death, disability or gross health or environmental damage, what are the cases? How in the UK are they dealt with?
Okay, well, thank you very much, and appreciate your integrity as always with regard to me not being able to comment on Grenfell. With regard to the wider position, it's fairly well-established law that a company as an entity, provided the statute, provided that the law allows it, is capable of being convicted of a criminal offence. And of course, you think of things like corporate manslaughter, gross negligence manslaughter being the human equivalent of when you're prosecuting an individual, but a company can be convicted of a corporate offence. And even though nobody goes to prison, it's important. Here's why. The fines can be huge. In many cases, the law now allows, there's been a movement in the last 3 or 4 years in respect of environmental offences just in the last year for an unlimited fine. So to hear talk of hundreds of millions in fines is now not a new thing, or it's now something that we're accustomed to. And that's actually quite good, because whereas in the US, if a company behaves very badly, you might have a class action and a jury. We don't have juries in those types of cases. A jury may, in the first instance, decide what the penalty might be. So you get those very large fines. The UK courts in civil cases, these are decided by judges in a much more cerebral way, and we haven't really had those types of slaps. So the idea that a company can be prosecuted for its malfeasance, I think, is an important criminally with mega fines as well as the damage.
I was just going to say that's the company, but then the bosses of these companies, although I have to say Labour, they're actually promising to ban bonuses for executives at water companies that seriously harm the environment. But what I'm saying, that you find the company, I guess that affects the shares. But the people who might have made those decisions at the top of the tree Does it affect their mortgage? Does it affect
Well,
their
yeah, there's a couple of things going. First of all, just very quickly, you don't just affect things like the share price and the P&L of a company when you do that. You actually send a warning. You can't persistently, blatantly pollute in the way. So these 168 million off the top of my head fines that are going to be given out to 3 offending water companies, I think they do perform an important deterrent role for the future. But you're right. Where individuals have misled. Well, first of all, there is already legislation that means that if you tell a falsehood, especially in a professional or a kind of technical context, long established law. We have a framework of fraud legislation that deals with that, and it doesn't have to be for your own benefit. It can be for the benefit of another. For example, the company that you're working for. And fraud, maximum sentence in the UK, 10 years. It's not a very pretty sentence, and people can get in circumstances when they run a trial and people have been injured or lives have been seriously damaged as a result. You can imagine sentences close to the maximum. Whether the government is also talking about new legislation about in relation to not misleading investigators, I think it's important that it's probably codified and that specifically people who are acting as officers of a company or officers of a public body, because this type of legislation often affects public bodies and quasi-public bodies that are carrying out public services, even if they're private. Well, I think it's important for a message to be sent with legislation that makes it very, very clear. These are your duties. This is what will happen to you otherwise. Should people trying to take my defense lawyer hat off and for a minute and think more of more from a citizen and a voter's point of view. Does it sound reasonable that somebody who misleads an investigator, a regulator, no less, that's charged with an important function in keeping us safe, especially if that causes risk of further damage to people's lives and people's health? Yeah, might prison be appropriate in those circumstances? I don't think you could rule it out.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joseph. Let's come to Mark Schnapp in the US. Of course, and as Joseph said, it's different in the US because juries decide and companies have been on the receiving end of, I'm thinking of Philip Morris, 206 billion, CVS, Walgreens, which have agreed to pay a massive amount to states that sue them for the drugs, trains, roles in the opioid crisis. There's quite a history, isn't there, in the US of big companies having to pay up for either misleading or hiding stuff, etc. Mark?
Yeah, I mean, let's sort of break that down a little bit. There are different bases for liability. First of all, in the tobacco cases, for example, which totaled among the various companies about 260 billion that had to be paid to the states. Those are civil cases, and they actually were so that was years and years of litigation. In fact, my old firm was involved in some of that for one of the companies, but that was a civil case. Separately, companies can have corporate liability for a couple of things, based on criminal liability as well, based upon two things: whether it's a corporate policy, for example, in toxic tort cases, or Boeing is going to have exposure, for example, in some of the cases that they have, for their problems with the aircraft, and those investigations are ongoing now. I've had cases involving the most common cases where you see corporate liability is in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Companies are involved in foreign bribery to get contracts overseas, and I had a case in particular involving a bribery case to get a light rail project in Qatar. And so the next question is, well, okay, the companies themselves can have liability, and typically, obviously, as Joseph said, you can't send a company to jail. So what do you do? So more often than not, companies are not convicted. What happens is they'll enter into what they call a deferred prosecution agreement or non-prosecution agreement, where they will pay a huge fine and enter into a monitorship for many years, most often 3 years, where they'll have to undergo various requirements for supervision. The second issue, which I think and then the individuals who were responsible not only could be liable for their for obstructing an investigation if in fact they implemented a corporate policy, but it's important that any individual has to be held liable for acting in the course and scope of their employment and not for their own benefit. And so there's been a movement actually in the past 2-3 years where the Deputy Attorney General announced at a white collar crime conference, which was a huge event, that the Department of Justice is going to seek individual liability of corporate officers for corporate policies that result in any kind of
I just want to take a break there because we're about to run out of time, and we'll take a break and come back to this, Mark. But it sounds like on both sides of the water, it's not just about the companies. They're going to be looking at individuals involved in these companies. After the break, more You Be the Judge, when we ask if parents should be criminally liable if their children harm somebody else, as in the case of the recent school shooting. And we'll have all things tech with our tech roundup. Plus, should cyclists have to have insurance so that if they do have an accident, there's a payout? All of that and a lot more right after this.